Hi, my name's Ryan Fgrave. I'm here with Jason Sandys for the episode 2 of the Community Tools Rule podcast. Jason is a senior systems consultant with Cortec. Hey, Jason.
Hello, Ryan. How you doing?
I'm all right. Hey, so let's just get right into it. So how have you been?
Doing quite well. As you mentioned, I work for Cortec now, so I'm not sure if everyone knows that, or not sure if everyone totally cares, but that's Cortec, so that's Kent Aggerland's company. So I got to plug them a little bit, right? They are my employer, and they do pay the bills.
Yeah. So how did you get into technology? So let's just go back to the beginning.
Good Lord, the beginning. That sounds like a long time ago. I guess really it just started at school. So went to university at the University of Michigan, and really I think my scholarship came from Uncle Sam. So I went through ROTC, and it was one of the choices that I could have at the time when I signed up for ROTC was choosing a major. And computer science was high on that list, so it was a very good probability of getting the scholarship if I chose something that they really wanted, and that was one of those things that they wanted. So that kind of started me down that path. Although before that, I'd always played with computers through high school, even through middle school. So it wasn't something that was totally new to me, but that was the push down the hill, effectively. This is what you will be doing. And so through university, I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in a computer science degree from the University of Michigan. From there, I went into the Air Force and did some programming, some Oracle programming, and then was put in charge of a small computer shop in Australia for the U.S. Air Force. And so that really pushed me along the way on the Microsoft side, because at that point, that was mid to late 90s, right? So NT4 days. Initial MCSE days, and so it was basically because of the nature of that shop in Australia, I pretty much became the technical expert, and so that pushed me along and kept me rolling downhill on the computer trajectory. And that was a long time ago, unfortunately.
What got you started with SCCM?
Yeah, so ConfigMgr was... I guess at the time it was still SMS, of course, right? So my first job after separating from the U.S. Air Force was as a contractor for the U.S. Air Force. So I didn't go too far from home, at least not from the employer. And the organization I latched onto there was using SMS, so I started getting an SMS there. When I joined on, there were a couple of SMS guys already that were doing a fair amount. That was 2001, 2002-ish. But they both moved on to bigger and better things. They actually became rapid response engineers for Microsoft, so they were pretty sharp guys. But then it all fell to me, so I pretty much had to quickly learn about SMS 2.0, and so everyone who remembers SMS 2.0, it was a rocky road, I guess is the way to say it, until probably Service Pack 5 came along. From there, I became a consultant, and I started doing a little bit more SMS stuff for other organizations. And then that just continued downhill until probably around 2008-ish, when that's pretty much, I guess really in the last 8 years, it's almost the only thing I've done is ConfigMgr and SMS consulting. Just because every consulting job that came up had my name on it, I guess, and that was all what it was about.
Very nice. Is there any reason you stick with ConfigMgr over any other technologies?
Yeah, I would love to say, some folks you'll ask at times, they'll say because I hate users, and that's why they either work with switches, they work with the networking gear, they work with servers, and yeah, I have my I don't know my aversion to users, just like most folks do, right? But I don't typically have to deal with them, which is a good thing. That's what the customers are for. That's what the help desk is for at the customer site. So really, it comes down to all of the different things we get to play with ConfigMgr. So you can't just be pigeonholed, right? We're not that DNS administrator that sits in the back room that only knows DNS. Mm-hmm. We have to know SQL Server. We have to know reporting. We have to know WMI. We have to know a lot about Windows itself and WMI. We have to know about, software installations and MSIs, and you can go off into a lot of different tangents. So ultimately, it's never boring, and there's always something new to explore. And today, right, it continues to almost reinvent itself, even with mobile device management. And that's evolving as we speak, right? It's different today than what it was even just 2 years ago as far as the mobile devices go. So there's always something new, and there's never anything that you're going to get pigeonholed into explicitly. So that's what it's right, keeps it fresh and real all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So within ConfigMgr, you make a lot of kind of tools for it. And how did you get into making tools? Like, what was the first tool you made?
Wow, I don't know really, honestly. So I've always, my background was with a CS degree was doing coding and development. So I did start out that way, and I did a fair amount of Oracle development back in the day, and I did a little bit of web. I think most people have dabbled in the web, but actually going in and doing some ASP stuff, and so that's always been kind of the core of my skill set is understanding the programming aspect of it, right? Where the code is actually coming from and how it was created. So that's always a huge benefit. So there's always been tools in that. As far as some of the tools I have now and that are out there, there's some VBScript stuff. So really, it comes out of customer need. Customers saying, "Hey, this is something we would like to do. How do we get this done?" And so one of the tools, or one of the more popular tools, I guess it's a tool that I have out there, is the startup script. That's VBScript. So I was at a customer one time, and how do we deploy clients? Well, there's these ways, but you guys are big enough. It was a customer of around, it was a hospital system that spanned most of the Southwest. So I don't remember how many clients they had, somewhere in the range of 19 to 20,000, and it was effectively, we're not going to be able to use client push. We have firewalls. What are we going to do? Okay, well, there's some great scripts out there. So I started looking at the scripts. And, of course, being a programmer, not saying my code is always the prettiest, but I looked at the scripts and went, oh, my God. Do these people that wrote them even know what these do? They're so spaghetti, right? They're so convoluted, such terrible logic in them, and I was like, there's no way I could recommend this to a customer. So at that point, it was like, well, let's figure out what these scripts are doing, or what I think these scripts are doing, because it wasn't always easy to tell, and let's rewrite it. And so that's exactly where the startup script came from. Was starting with, I know Brian had one at Wells Fargo that he let me look at that they had adopted from somewhere. There was another guy up in Pennsylvania. I have no idea what his name is anymore. He had one that a lot of folks used, but it was a lot of spaghetti code. And there were a couple of other smaller ones floating around out there that I kind of based or used as inspiration. So not one specific one. And it kind of started from there, and I didn't really expect anyone to really use it. And then it was all of a sudden I started having people tell me, yeah, I'm using it. So that was really probably my first bigger tool that I had a lot of folks use. But it always comes out of customer need, right? It's, hey, customer needs this, and I figure, hey, this is cool, because it kind of goes back to me keeping ConfigMgr fresh, or ConfigMgr always being fresh for me, is I'm kind of inventing new little areas potentially, and I kind of get to go back to my roots, because I like coding on small things. I hate coding like on huge projects, right? Those projects that take you 4 years, those are painful. And I think most developers feel that way anyway. So, but if I can do something that's tangible, that I can have immediate impact to the customer on it and solve that problem for them with something that works and works well, then that's huge benefit. And I generally tend to like the scripting aspect of it, the PowerShell piece of it especially, because it's something that the customer can maintain, and it's very transparent as to what we're doing. Binaries have their place for sure, but when it's something you're doing for a customer, they can't modify those binaries. So you've kind of locked them into something, but they still have their place. So.
Yeah. So with since we started with the client startup script, so how long did it take you to write that? Because that's a really long script.
Yeah. So it's obviously evolved over time, right? If you look at the release notes, and you'll see the dates that are in there, and granted, most of the additions were relatively small, from anywhere from just a couple lines of code up to maybe 20, 30, and I have no idea what the line count is right now, but it's fairly big still. I think the initial versions probably took me a couple weeks, but I was actually literally sitting at the customer, and it was a major need, so they were effectively paying for that to be written. And so that's a good thing for the entire community, especially when at the end of it you go, hey, this is great for you guys, but it can help a lot of other folks. Can we go ahead and put that out there and let other people use it? And so anytime I do stuff like that, I definitely always ask the customer, hey, that exact question, right? You guys have a problem, right? As long as there's nothing explicit to the customer in there. And I've never had a customer tell me no, so that's always been a good thing for everyone. But yeah, to answer the actual question, I honestly have no idea. I think the original took me probably 1 to 2 weeks to write, and then it just evolved from there.
Okay. So what are a lot of the pieces of that script? Because I know it does a lot more than just install a client.
Yeah, so the big things that it does, really, it's kind of started as a health check too. So back, of course, in the SMS 2003 days and then in the ConfigMgr 2007 days, we were working with this Stone Age operating system called Windows XP, which had a lot of pieces that liked to break. WMI, as most of us know, being the main one. And WMI liked to break, so that was always the thing, was doing some basic health checks. And that's what all the other scripts out there were, or a lot of them were doing, particularly for client push, for other things, right? We want to check to make sure some basic required services are on. We want to make sure that bits is actually enabled and running. We want to make sure the task scheduler is enabled and running. We want to make sure that DCOM is enabled and running. Not that ConfigMgr explicitly needs DCOM unless you're doing a client push. But doing those health checks is really what it comes down to. Because, you know, and it's one of the reasons they put in the CCM eval task into ConfigMgr 2012, since ConfigMgr sits on top of those things. If those things are broken, ConfigMgr can't check itself because ConfigMgr is broken now also. So you need something outside of the ConfigMgr process to check all those things that the ConfigMgr agent really relies on. And some of those basic ones are just services being started, right? That's a lot of the times users, right, our wonderful users that we all have the aversion to, that have local admin privileges, which was relatively common in the XP days particularly, would like to turn services off because they thought they knew better. And so if you turn that service off, even if you turn the ConfigMgr agent service off, right, ConfigMgr itself is not going to work. So we want to go through and check all those things. And it expanded from there too, right? There are other things in there like deleting registry keys or modifying registry keys. So another thing a lot of folks did was use a group policy to set the site code for ConfigMgr. And that's, I was about to say it's great, but it's actually not great, particularly since that group policy isn't a true group policy. It sets or actually tattoos a value in the registry. So tattooing a value in the registry means that if you remove that group policy, it doesn't actually remove that value. So folks, particularly in the migration from 2007 to 2012, they were setting up new sites, right, new site code. But now we have this value tattooed in the registry. They thought they could just remove the group policy. Well, it doesn't work that way because it's not a true group policy. So that's one of the cases where if you're running a startup script, you can just change that, and it's a very simple matter, right? You don't have to be a programmer. My configuration file is in XML. Human readable, most people are used to XML, not too big of a deal, but you don't have to write any actual VBScript code. You don't have to do any of that kind of stuff now to delete that value out of the registry without having to worry about anything else. So it's a lot of those type of pre-checks and being able to do some intelligent things outside of the ConfigMgr agent itself.
Okay. Was your startup script always going to be VBScript? Did you ever try any other languages?
Yeah, so at the time when I wrote a VBScript was ubiquitous, and that's always what it comes down to, is what's ubiquitous everywhere, right? And I'm trying to think if, ConfigMgr 2007, I don't even think supported Windows 2000, so that was never really in the picture. But of course at the time it was XP, right? And PowerShell. I'm sure PowerShell was at the 1.0 stage or so at that time. I don't remember explicitly when I wrote it what was actually out. But that wasn't ubiquitous by any means, particularly on XP systems. And even today, right, you've got a lot of organizations with Windows 7 who still haven't rolled out WMF. And so they don't have PowerShell either. So, yeah, I've been asked, well, why not rewrite this in PowerShell? Well, it kind of goes back to the question, or kind of, the number of lines of code, right? That VBScript is huge. Now, granted, a PowerShell script would have a probably significantly fewer number of lines of code, but at the same time, you still got to rewrite it and you still got to test it all. And I think that's the other thing that's come with my VBScript code, since it has been out there for at least the core of it probably for, I don't know, 10 years or so, maybe not quite that long, 8 years. It's been well vetted by many, many, many production environments. And so if it's not broke, don't fix it. As long as people aren't disabling VBScript in their environment, then it works quite well.
Yeah, it's probably been run a few million times, so.
For sure, right? And then, yeah, there's still little bugs here and there, for sure. There always is, right? Anyone who's never written a buggy line of code has never written code, period, right? And I think that's there's variations of that saying that are out there, for sure. So.
All right.
Yep.
So yeah, then wanted to go into probably your other big tool, the one that you're known for is the UI++.
Yeah, that one's a cool tool for sure.
Yeah, it's a nice UI for OSD. And so why is it written in C++, right?
Correct. Yeah, so that one obviously is not a script, so kind of going back to my comments before, that's why I hedged my bets a little bit on why I always use a VBScript, right? But it's native code because it was going to run during WinPE. That's the main scenario that it was written for. I was running it through WinPE. So getting nice GUI things really requires native code, particularly pre-PowerShell. Now, with PowerShell, we can start hooking into WPF. And we could use Windows Forms, although Windows Forms generally aren't as pretty. But WPF obviously can be. But I'm a big believer in aesthetics, right? So if I go to a web page even, and I'm going to buy something, if that web page looks like it was done by, the kid down the street, I'm probably not going to buy from them. Because there's just aesthetics to me, and in general, right? I mean, it's a very true statement, equate to the professionalism of the organization behind it and the what you can expect from that organization. At least, or I think it's really the reverse, right? Not having the aesthetics equates to not being professional. Mm-hmm. So just because you have a beautiful website doesn't necessarily mean you're professional, but not having the beautiful website almost definitely means you're not professional. And so there's no way that I'm going to do business with you and or give you my hard-earned money. And so the same with the UIs out there, right? We've seen the MDT UIs, and they were all using HTAs. Very hard to make those pretty, although some people have gone through some great pains to make some of those at least relatively attractive, right, so that they're not hideous like they were. But generally, HTAs are pretty ugly, and so I really never wanted that look and feel. But initially, the basic requirement, same thing, right, came from a customer. Hey, and it was actually a bank. We have 3 scenarios in our bank, and not that I remember explicitly what they were, but it was probably like teller, loan officer, and then manager or executive or something like that. And all of our systems fall into these 3 scenarios. So when the tech deploys a system during operating system deployment, we need to be able to choose one of these scenarios as well as choose a couple of other things. So the basic criteria are there. So we got to be able to show the GUI. And within OSD, it's always interacting with the COM object that holds the task sequence variables. So you needed a COM compliance tool that will be able to do that. So my initial things that I built way back when, I actually built using AutoIT. It's a scripting environment, if you're familiar with it, right? And it actually compiled into native code. So it actually had kind of both of the advantages there. It was really a script, but it compiled into an EXE. And that worked pretty well for some real simple GUIs, but it was very hard-coded, kind of like a script typically is. And it also didn't offer the prettiest UI. It was kind of like Windows Forms, right? They were kind of generic, bland, and they did okay. But so from there it evolved, and it was kind of me, spreading my wings, saying, "Hey, I want to do some cool UI stuff, or I want to do some cool coding." And I remember my C++ days, which is pretty much most of my Oracle programming was all C++, and I've done a fair amount of other C++. So it was a chance for me to get into doing that. And of course, C++ can be COM compliant, right? That's the whole point of COM, is that it was portable, and I could call that stuff from there. And I also had a background in MFC, so a lot of people have a lot of opinions on MFC. That's the GUI framework that comes with Visual C++. So I used that, and I also wanted to make it pretty too. So the initial builds and the initial that, I didn't really have it as pretty as I do today. Pretty in my opinion, of course, and pretty is always in the eye of the beholder, right? So I went through and went through some great pains to try to make it look professional, right? So that when an actual professional organization puts it out to their users or their techs that that's exactly what it looks like. So I think I've gotten the aesthetics pretty well there.
Do you think you've spent more time programming in the aesthetics and the look of it than the actual function behind it?
No, but I do get bogged down in it, creating icons. I've changed the icons in it like 3 or 4 times, right? Because that's one of those immediate gratification things that you get bogged down in it, but when you're done with it, you're done with it, and you see this immediate overall change, right? I guess in a way, and not that I put makeup on, but you could probably equate it to folks putting makeup on, right, in the morning. They take a lot of time, but there's this complete change that they have on their outward appearance, and that reflects on, hopefully, I mean, I think this is their motivations, right? It reflects on how they view themselves and how they want other people to perceive them. And so, that's kind of all part of it, is making it look that way. So, yeah, at times I definitely have gotten bogged down in some of it, but the actual functionality at times and researching how to do certain things, I've definitely spent more time on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned a lot of cool things along the way too, and I think that's the power of knowing the programming behind it, knowing the APIs behind Windows and what the Windows developers and even the ConfigMgr developers and the other developers at times, what their intentions are. Gives you a lot of insight on what the tool capability should and shouldn't be, where you should and shouldn't go, and what the limitations are. And some of these things. The one example that always comes to mind, because I talk about this one every now and then, is I was researching how to figure out what OS version was actually running on. So in doing this, I stumbled across all the API documentation and realized in the API documentation they deprecated all the functions to do this. And the interesting thing at that point is that it all relates back to application compatibility, right? So if you look at app-compat, the number one reason that applications weren't compatible going from XP to Vista and then Vista to 7 going forward is because of version check, right? You have these applications that were checking for explicit versions of an application or of Windows. So they would check for exactly 5.1 or 5.x, right? Instead of being intelligent and saying greater than 5. So Microsoft realized that this is what these developers were doing, and so they deprecated all the functions that say or that actually return the real value of Windows, and all of the functions that are actually in there and supported say am I version X or above, and you can only choose these or above APIs. So just researching that little thing, I stumbled into this whole app-compat tale, right? And I knew the whole background app-compat stuff, right? That was the main issue from Chris Jackson, right? The app-compat guy, and that. And then that kind of interesting close the loop that Microsoft's not just sitting still; they're actually doing these things to force people along and to force that. So that's totally has nothing to do with UI++ itself. Yet at the same time, it helps my understanding of the ConfigMgr ecosystem and what people are doing with ConfigMgr and app-compat in general, because it's all kind of part of that same big story of managing clients.
Yeah.
And there's so many other little things that you stumble along the way when you start researching some of this stuff and how the developers go about doing their jobs. And so it helps you in all these little different ways, I think.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So yeah, did you want to talked about UI++? Did you want to show it off?
Absolutely. So let me go ahead and share my screen out here. And I am going to present my entire desktop over there, looking at the screen back over there, making sure that I have the right one. And there we go. Let me know when you can see that. It should be shared.
All right, there we go.
Excellent. So the other thing that happened with UI++ along the way, the scenario I talked about initially was using it for OSD, right? Choosing those scenarios, maybe putting the username in or putting a computer name into the process so that that could be used during the task sequences. But the other thing I realized along the way is, hey, there's no reason that this isn't applicable outside of ConfigMgr. So at one point, the tool was called OSD++ because it was very much tooled for being run during a task sequence. But there are always needs, or there are a lot of needs outside of task sequences, even when you want to solicit information from the interactive user. And so that's where the rebrand to UI++ came from. And so there's a lot of scenarios that can be addressed that way. We just want to ask the users a question and collect that information back, whatever that is. So one of the perfect examples for that always is maintenance windows, right? Especially when you're dealing with lots of servers, potentially. You want to ask all the server administrators, hey, what's the maintenance window? And so this is a perfect tool for getting that done. So let's see here. Let's go into my folder here. And I think this is a relatively current build. We'll be able to go with that. And we basically have two executables. There's a UI++64 and a UI++. The reason being because if we do run this from WinPE, WinPE 64-bit doesn't have the x86 binaries or the subsystem in it, the WoW64 subsystem, so it can only run 64-bit code. So therefore I have the two different ones, right? Generally, I just run the 64-bit on most systems that I'm at. It's all configured via this XML file, which we'll view from Notepad. Right? You can use whatever you want to use to edit this one, though. You can certainly use Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code or whatever you want. I have no idea what this file actually was from. I think this is just a generic file that I've used for testing certain things at different times. And there's basically a bunch of different actions. So everything that UI++ ultimately shows in a GUI framework is driven from this XML file. And you can throw up dialog boxes, you can throw up questions, you can throw up multiple choice, you can throw up an app tree, you can throw up authentication. And of course I click on it and it's not going to work on this box because, and I don't remember why. But the other cool thing, of course, is I put logging in here, just like I have for everything else. So we can actually go see that. I won't spend any real time on troubleshooting this. We'll go to another box or another XML file that I know that works. And we'll actually look at that if I can't see exactly what's wrong with that XML file right off the bat. But you know, just like all of ConfigMgr, right, we have log files. So I definitely built a log file in here that tells you exactly what's going on, why things aren't working. Doesn't tell me exactly where, but it told me my XML file is messed up. So if we looked at my XML file real quick, I vaguely remember a tick mark not being in here somewhere, but I won't spend time. I'll just grab another XML file, and we will use that one.
So that's nice. It's in the CM trace format, the logs are.
Yeah, exactly. So I went through some pain of making sure that I figured out what that CM trace format was. It wasn't a whole lot of pain, but you know, it's just a tagged format, kind of sort of similar like to XML, and making sure that it did that, because obviously most people that are going to be using this initially are ConfigMgr folks. So, okay, so obviously a different XML file here. Get rid of all the other candy here. Right, so we want to choose an OS for this system. We want to choose a role for this system. And if we actually looked at the XML for this, I'll go back in here. And notice it's an always on top window too, so I can't even move things in front of it, so you'll have to kind of look behind. I'll highlight a couple things in here, but I'll move it off to the side over here. You know, this is all just purely defined straight within the XML file, so if we want to add additional choices, we just add a couple of lines here, right? And we just had two choices on this one dialog itself. From there, it actually, if I click OK, it's actually going to pre-populate a name for this system, and that's based off of the chassis type, right? So we're actually doing some conditions in here to set, hey, we won't need this thing to start with a D, or actually in this case I think it ends with a D, or ends with an L, or it ends with an X if it's a desktop, laptop, or other, and then it requires a 5-digit. So this input box here actually uses a regular expression. So regular expressions are something I'm very fond of because they're super powerful. They can be super confusing though. And so it's actually enforcing us to put a specific name in here. So you can see the tooltip here says, hey, we have to have an A followed by 5 digits, followed by X. But of course, 5 zeros isn't valid. But if I put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, notice everything goes away and my checkbox lights up. And then I can go on. So that one's a real simple example. We can add other things, and actually I still have them in here. Let me uncomment the XML and we'll run it again. My lab is no longer called Lab 1, it's called Lab 100. So let me go ahead and save that, and then we'll add this back in here also. This is just a generic dialog box to pop up information. So let me go ahead and run it again. So and the other kind of cool part here is, right, I'm just straight up testing it right in a full-blown Windows instance because it's not limited to just running in PE, so I can actually do all of that. So in this case, this is an authentication box, so I'm actually going to put that in there. Hopefully I remember my password. There's my lab. I can cancel out of here. I can have a maximum number of retries. This is authentication, but it'll also do authorization by checking group membership. So we'll actually, it's doing the authentication using LDAP over SSL, and it will also query for specific groups to make sure that you're a member of a specific group specified. And it went pretty quick there. There was a little thing that flashed that said authenticating, but in my small lab environment, that authentication over LDAP takes kind of a short period of time. And there you go. So all this text in here can be customized. Actually, this bar over here on the side can be customized as well, and you can put an icon down here. And then basically we get kind of the same thing. These can all be completely reordered based upon however you want to put things in there. And the other thing I said before, this is obviously a virtual machine, or maybe not so obvious, but it is. That's why the X is here, and it pre-populated that. But if this were a laptop, it would have pre-populated with an L and enforced an L, or if it was a desktop, it would have pre-populated with a D and then forced the D in there. There's a whole concept of putting an app tree in here also for whatever the interactive user is, to fill in applications or to check applications out of the tree so that those get installed during the task sequence also. It also, let's see here, I got to remember what some of the other tasks are in here. There is at least one other task. I'm trying to think. Where are we? This is actually my development environment here. Let's see if I can call it up. I haven't upgraded this to 1606 yet, but it is there. Show you maybe a different, more advanced XML file that I use in some of the testing. So that's always one kind of downfall of my tools and maybe some of the community tools out there. If my VM will actually log in here, that is. I think my VM is kind of slowing down, so we'll skip that for right now. But as I was saying, some of the downfalls of the community tools on occasion, initially, right, it's hard to test them because you just don't have the test environments. But in the long run, kind of like we're talking about with the startup script, there's a ton of testing that actually gets done. So it's kind of cool. If you're an early adopter, you might always be aware that you're probably helping the developer out, which isn't a bad thing, right? Just be aware. And then, but if you're one of the later adopters, usually things have been worked out really, really, really well. So I know there are some other scripts over here to show. Oh, I know where they are. To show maybe the app tree piece of it. Here we go. I've got a ton of them in this folder. Let's see what's in this one. Yeah, this one has applications in it. So let me rename it. Now, there is a config parameter, so we could actually launch the executable with the config parameter itself instead of having to rename it. But it will always search for this default one if it doesn't give a config parameter. Oh, yeah, pre-flight checks. This is another one. You can customize all the pre-flight checks that you want. These are 4 ones that I built. These are all in the XML itself. I added this after I was at a customer a few years back, and we reloaded a laptop, and it was actually a user's laptop at the time. And we were doing state restores, but we weren't thinking at the time. We just weren't paying attention, I guess. And it was connected to the wireless network. So by the time it got around to reinstalling Windows and then going back to restore the user's data, it couldn't because it was connected. Well, right, even before restoring the user's data, it's not like it killed the user's data or anything. It was still out there, or it was still on the drive. But it killed Windows because Windows couldn't join the domain, and all of our stuff just went awry because we were still connected to the wireless network. Or initially, the laptop was connected to the wireless network and, of course, couldn't connect back. So it's like, I need to add some pre-flight checks in here so that just in case, right? And the battery's a good one too, minimum memory. And then the other thing that came about in Windows 8, and I don't remember the details here, but they added some specific CPU requirements, right? There was the NX capability, there was the SSE and SSE2, basically instructions that the chipset on the motherboard had to support, or actually that the CPU had to support. And, so I've actually added those in here too. So we don't want those to happen, or we don't want it to carry on. And if it fails out, it'll have that big red X here. And so there's not much the user can do at that point in time if it happens during a task sequence. So here's my user authentication again. Notice the color is different over here too. So those are kind of some of those little aesthetic things. We can hide these icons. These icons are static. Oh, and notice this one actually has the authorization in it, right? So I'm not a member of whatever group was specified in the XML file, which I have no idea what it is offhand. So we'll go ahead and just take that one out of the XML and then do it again. It's this condition right here. Actually, we'll just get rid of the authentication completely. It should just be this. That doesn't seem right to me. There's another action in here that I'm missing. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's why. We need to add that one back in. And we have our, where are you? Info, user auth right here. So let's get rid of that. And then we'll finally be able to show you the app tree. So there's my pre-flight, my test. And of course the app tree is probably not in that one either. You'll see, you have to take my word for it at this point in time. It is in the documentation to do the app tree. So I'm in the process of actually potentially adding some additional capabilities there as well. So there's always some interesting challenges around security there, but potentially being able to look at what applications are on the system currently and restoring those applications so that we could have a mapping. We're going to look through add remove programs and say, hey, if you have 7-zip today, whatever version of 7-zip, when we go through and run the task sequence to do a refresh scenario, we're going to install the latest version of 7-zip, right? So basically, application mapping so that you can have your applications restored or reinstalled during a refresh task sequence. So that's one of the things that I'm currently adding there, as well as having it come maybe from group memberships. So that's kind of a pie in the sky thing too, so that you could drop a user into a group and then based upon that group membership. Now there's some interesting challenges around that one too, the authentication being a part of that. So I haven't thought around exactly how to do some of that. But it's maybe once a customer actually tells me they want it, then I'll sit down and work a little bit harder on that piece, because that's ultimately, like the pre-flight check is, oh my God, I ran into this at a customer, let me go do it. We're actually working with Kaido, Ben this week and last week. He's currently at a customer, so he's deploying this for a customer, and he had a couple of small needs, and I was like, okay, well, I don't have that currently, so let me go code it for you. So I actually have a new version that's unreleased right now that has a couple of little additional things in there. And I've done that for Kim before too. Kim will come to me and say, hey, what about this? And I'll be like, oh yeah, that's easy, let me go do that for you. And then it's immediate testing too, because those guys can go and test it. I've actually done that with the startup script also, interestingly enough. Nash came to me a few weeks ago and said, hey, can you do this? And I'm like, yeah, let me do that for you. So I sent it off to Nash, but of course I haven't heard back from Nash. So Nash, if you're watching this, tell me if it worked or not. He hasn't responded to any of my tweets, but with Kaido, it's interesting though, because of course he lives in Estonia. So I sit down at my computer at about 8 every morning, and he gives me some time to settle in, but then I'll get an IM, hey, it worked, or hey, can you do this? But it's cool to get the immediate feedback on that kind of stuff, right? That what I'm doing, like I was talking about before, it's that immediate gratification. It's something that helps someone and has that immediate impact for them.
So that kind of also goes into, like, how do you usually get ideas for your different tools? Are they usually from clients or suggestions or?
Yeah, so combination thereof for sure. Like I just said, those were a lot of the initial reasoning for me to do a lot of this is what I'm seeing or I'm doing currently at a customer, and making sure that I have that ability to provide that need for the customer. And so sometimes, especially with this kind of code, like if it's a script, I'll typically do it on-site with the customer. If it's something like this, I'll be like, yeah, this is going to benefit a lot of other people. I'm going to go home and do this at night, and that's what I do for that. But then now that I posted the tool on my blog, and a lot of people talk about it in different places, I get feedback via my blog, and sometimes I get direct email via the contact forms, and I'll ask people, hey, well, why do you need this? How can we do this better? And that kind of stuff. So that's there. So definitely both avenues. Other avenues are sometimes watching what other people do. So there are other front ends out there that do most of them are very specific and do things very specifically for whatever they were created for. But you know, the pre-flight check one, I did that one. Troy Welch from 1E had a blog post out there about, you know, good things to do during a pre-flight check. And so it's like, well, you know, someone's already written something and had some other experiences, obviously, around pre-flight checks. So let's go figure out what they've done. So definitely inspiration on what other folks have done is a big piece of that too. So, yeah, it's always about real world. So I can do all this stuff all I want, you know, in a closed box. But if I'm not helping anybody, it doesn't really matter. So that's where those real world scenarios are very beneficial.
Yeah, and Cortec has their own also.
Yeah, so Cortec wrote an HTA. There's an HTA. I'm not sure if it was Klaus or Jakob or who exactly wrote that. So I don't know if I've ever even looked at it. But there's always overlap in some of this, right? And how much time and effort you want and to put into some of it. I think the HTAs can be good. It kind of goes back to that, you know, leaving something behind at the customer that they can themselves maintain. Mm-hmm. So for me, the tool is flexible enough, UI++ is flexible enough that they will be able to maintain it. They have to learn the XML language, if you will, a little bit, right? The syntax or really the schema that I put out there for UI++, but they can change it, so I haven't pigeonholed them in anywhere. But there are folks who like messing around with HTAs and doing that kind of stuff. It just kind of depends upon how much they like beating their head against the wall, I guess.
Okay, so I have some other questions here about just kind of tools in general. Like, what's your favorite tool that you've made?
I think UI++. It's the funnest tool. I think, you know, like I said, the UI piece of it is the piece that I spend probably way too much time in because that's fun. But you know, that was one of the things I touted when I started making it, was I made these rounded corners on the dialog boxes, as you saw. And the reason I did that specifically was because UDI, if anyone's actually used UDI or maybe still using UDI, when they first created it, that's what they did. They had rounded corners and they made it like look kind of cool. And so that all goes to, hey, I want to kind of stomp on MDT a little bit here and steal MDT's thunder to a certain extent. So I've got to make sure I one-up them in a lot of different ways, and that was one of the ways to one-up them. So, and then there was, you know, other learning pieces that happened within it. Just like with ConfigMgr, I go off in these other little tangents. Like one of the things I added in there was the whole conditional syntax, so that I can make any action within there conditional. Well, I started down the path of writing my own syntax to do that, right, and my own interpreter to do that. And yeah, that was going to be a lot of pain. So at that point I discovered, well, hey, look, VBScript at the end of the day is really just implemented as a COM object, and actually so is JScript, right? Anything in the Windows scripting library is just a COM object. So I just got to go figure out how to invoke that. Well, like, you know, most things, someone else has already gone down that path, at least with some example code. And so I was able to actually push all of VBScript straight into UI++. And so all of my conditional syntax gets actually sent to a VBScript interpreter that's part of the system, right? I didn't have to build anything. All I got to do is send my expression to the VBScript COM object, let it evaluate it, let it return a true or false, and I'm good. So that's, you know, it was a tangent, had nothing really to do with managing client systems, nothing to do with ConfigMgr, but it was still an interesting tangent, and it was something that I had to go and spend some cognitive power on, which is always a good thing. I think, you know, kept me fresh and kept me up to date on that stuff. And I've even gone so far as looking and trying to directly implement PowerShell in different ways. That's a whole different interesting thing, because calling PowerShell from native code is very non-trivial. So I've never really been able to go down that route. I found some example code that some really high level, actually the code itself is really super in depth, and so you start talking about COM interop at that point in time, which totally, you know, at times I've learned COM and I've learned how to do COM, but I've never really implemented it in production. So every time I look at COM in depth anymore, I always have to go back and relearn it, right? It's one of those things, if you've never really done it, you got to relearn it all the time. And so then I start looking at this COM interop code and I'm like, yeah, that's not worth it anymore. Let me move on to something else. And yeah, so like I said, at the end of the day, there's always something new to look at, and there's always something new to research, you know, or even, you know, talking about in the app tree, or adding the ability to restore applications. So I had to go research, well, where does Windows store ARP data? And how does Windows store ARP data? So I had to go do a ton of research in figuring that piece of it out. And you start getting into, particularly with that one, there's no good answer for that one. Because it's kind of like this secret sauce that they haven't published explicitly anywhere. And so you end up having to piece all these different things together that people have put together over the years. And you can actually finally come up with what everyone thinks is exactly where they get ARP data from, but no one truly knows outside of Microsoft because it's not really publicly documented. So
just use Win32 product.
Yeah, I know you're saying that facetiously. So, a lot of people do use that one, but
right.
Yeah, there are some grave repercussions potentially to doing that. So, and the other thing, Win32 product I think only does MSIs anyway. I'm not positive on that one, so I don't think it actually does anything else. So I want to be able to do EXEs or anybody who's added anything to ARP. And so the MSIs can do it, right? There's a whole series of APIs, or really there's an ARP table, I think, in MSIs that'll do all of that stuff for you. But the actual APIs, there's no real query ARP table. There's nothing like that within Windows itself. So you end up having to dig through the registry, and it's pretty well defined in the registry, but then there's all these values that are undefined. There's these system values that aren't documented anywhere publicly. And so you have to kind of piece all these things together from what other people have had to say. And it pays benefits too, right? So going, that's another one of those, this is something I learned doing this, and then when the customer comes and says, hey, we want to remove QuickTime from all of our systems, how do we do it? And then they say, well, we found this blog post, and it says you use Win32 product, right? Exactly like you just mentioned, right? You say, no, right? Don't use Win32 product, but I do know the magic here. I do know where all of this information is actually stored at in the registry because I went and researched it for a completely different reason, although kind of a related reason, really. Mm-hmm. And so I know exactly how to pull this out. So one of the scripts I recently published was, remove kind of a universal product removal script so that it will go in and query for a product and run the uninstall string from it. And it was exactly for that reason. They wanted to uninstall QuickTime from all of their systems, and they were also transitioning from Adobe Reader to Foxit. So they wanted to get rid of Adobe Reader on all of their systems also in a quick and easy fashion. And if you have one version of a product across the board, no big deal. You have one uninstall string. But of course, with both of those products, you've probably got tens of versions of those, and so you don't want to have to go hunt down all those uninstall strings and then hope that you've accounted for them all. You want to just be able to search somewhere, and so that's exactly what that script does. And it was all based upon my knowledge of researching stuff in UI++. So it all kind of came full circle. It's interesting how often that happens.
Yeah. Also, are you I know you said you were working on a few new additions to UI++. Are you working on anything else or any other new things in the work?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop my session here. Wait a minute, I got to go click over here to do that. Stop my presentation, that is. Yeah, so I've been researching doing a tool, kind of a console supplemental tool that allows you to do things in the console. So one of the questions that comes up quite often, and at the customer I just finished with, it came up, and it comes up on the forums all the time, is, hey, we've got these console-centric administrative tasks that we want to do. And a lot of times they're things en masse, like we want to add all of these systems to this collection. How do we quickly get this done? So the easy answer there, and a good answer, is definitely do PowerShell. However, most medium to low-level administrators have no clue, right? And you don't even want to introduce them to that because they'll just, go into a hole and cry. So giving them a way to do some of the equivalent en masse type functions in the console, but through another tool, right? Or maybe an extension to the console too. Doesn't really matter. So one of them, and not that it's a great example because there are lots of ways to get this one done. There are other tools out there, but would be adding lots of systems based upon some criteria to a collection. I think one of the ones that came up was, enabling incremental or disabling incremental from collections based upon some criteria. That was actually, we went through a review at my customer, and we, if you remember the numbers, you're not supposed to have more than 200. That was the initial recommendation. It's not the true recommendation anymore, but you're not supposed to have incremental updates enabled on more than 200 collections. So we went through, and out of there, I don't remember how many collections they had. That wasn't a crazy number. It was like 1,000 collections or so, but about 400 of them had incremental enabled. And really, then we open up CE Viewer and we see that the incremental evaluations are actually taking longer than our 10-minute cycles, so they started having issues. So it's like, well, let's go figure out which collections don't actually need to be updated. And so there's various PowerShell scripts out there that will help you get that data. And really the criteria we explicitly used was, well, when's the last time the membership has changed in this collection, right? Anything that hasn't changed membership in this its collection membership within the last 2 weeks almost certainly doesn't need to have incremental evaluations turned on. And so we found about half of them at least didn't have that. So then we had to go through and manually turn that off. And actually we did that via PowerShell, feeding a text file in. So yeah, I could get that done. But having that kind of data at the fingertips. But of course, at the same time, I don't want to use MFC because I touched on that before. So obviously, that's a very developer-centric task. But MFC is still out there, still works, but it's pretty bloated. Most folks that do any native code will tell you that they don't even use MFC anymore, and probably haven't used MFC for a long time. So at that point, I start looking at other frameworks, WTL, and I'm like, well, maybe I should just do .NET, right? I always sometimes shy away from .NET, sometimes kind of gravitate back towards it. So now I got to go back and learn WPF again. So that's what I'm actually in the process of doing, right? And I think that's always the fun part for me is the learning and the researching process. I think I've talked about that a few times. Is I got this challenge. Well, let me go do the research and the learning on it. So I've done C# in the past. I've done WPF in the past, but since I haven't done it in a while, now I've got to kind of go back and relearn it all again to be able to start this tool. So the tool itself has kind of two purposes for me. It's to learn C# and WPF and have fun with that, as well as provide a tool that the customers can use. So that is kind of what I've got to finish my WPF book and my C# book so that I can move on to that. So I need some more longer air flights that I can stay awake on.
Just do some overseas work. There you go.
Well, I am going to Oslo at the end of the month, so that'll be a good 7-8 hour flight. So yeah, I'll have plenty of time to read on the flight.
All right. So yeah, I think that's kind of about the time. So how would we keep up to date with your news? Follow you on Twitter or?
Yeah, so that's the common question there, right? Obviously, I try to blog. I do a blog quite often on occasion. Like I'll throw up 6 or 7 posts within a couple weeks, and then it'll go a couple months, right? So the blog is the main place for my tooling and that kind of stuff. So that's ConfigMgr FTW.com. So that's all that stuff out there. But Twitter's typically the best place for most folks. I had that question at a customer recently. They're like, how do I stay up with all this stuff? And I'm like, Twitter. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah. It's like, well, I used to follow my IT forum. I'm like, my IT forum still has some folks blogging, but it's not a news aggregator like it used to be. It doesn't pull everything in from every corner that had to do with SMS and System Center like it used to be. And there really is nothing like that anymore. But if you follow a central kind of socially sourced site like Twitter, then you for sure, no caller ID. Sorry about that. If you follow that centrally sourced place like Twitter, then you're going to get all of these different people that are watching all of these other sources, and they kind of feed into that central location, and then you can be discerning and figure out what you want and what you don't want. But if you follow the right people that also follow the right people, right? So that's kind of the cool part about Twitter is it's a tree. You're not just following Johan. You're not just following Kent. You're following Johan and all the things that he's picked out from all the people that he follows. And same with any of the other folks. And the cool part about Twitter now, recently, the ConfigMgr product group, a lot of them have started tweeting also, including David James, who's the lead architect. And so it's kind of cool to see David actually retweeting people and putting out news. And it's something so much quicker. I'm not sure if Microsoft Marketing is actually looking at their stuff because they're putting stuff out in real time, which I doubt that to me that means marketing's probably not looking at it. But that's a good thing, right? We don't need marketing in the way to say, hey, a hotfix is coming. We all know that, or they all know that. There's no reason they should have to filter that explicitly. So being able to watch those guys, who they're watching, and everyone else is a great place for that stuff. And same for all of my stuff.
Yeah. Do you have any speaking engagements coming up?
Yep, so that's that trip to Oslo. Oslo will be a user group in Oslo. From there, I go to System Center Universe Europe, which is in Berlin, that same week. And those are the two there. I don't have any other user groups here in the U.S. set up at this point. I just got back from Michigan. I did the Detroit user group. It's called, I think it's just called the Michigan user group. That was actually last week. And then there's one on the west side of Michigan. It's actually on Lake Michigan. It's the Southwest Michigan user group or something like that. So I just got back from those. And of course I did Minnesota a little while ago, and I did Madison a little while ago also. But I don't have any other user groups here in the U.S. scheduled. So hopefully soon, but it's kind of getting towards the latter half of the year with the holidays, and Ignite's in there, and there's other things. So it may not be till next year again.
All right then. So thank you for coming on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
All right.
It's always good to share and talk.
Right.
Talk to the little screen in front of me.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So that was it for this podcast. Join us next month where we'll be interviewing Nikolai Anderson.